The children I mentor have a warning gesture for threats, and they gave it when their stepfather showed up. I was explaining a math problem to Lily, age 10, at the community center on a Wednesday afternoon when I saw it. Her right hand moved to her left shoulder, fingers touching her collarbone twice in quick succession. The gesture lasted maybe 3 seconds. Most people wouldn't have noticed, but I'd created that signal specifically for moments like this, when the kids I mentored felt unsafe but couldn't verbally say so. I looked up from the worksheet to see what had triggered it and felt my stomach drop. A man in his late 30s was standing in the doorway of the tutoring room, scanning the space until his eyes landed on Lily and her younger brother Noah, age 7. Both children had gone completely still, faces blank in that way kids learn when they're trying to become invisible. The man smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes, and started walking toward us. Lily's hand moved to her shoulder again. Noah's followed. 2 threat signals in 10 seconds. I didn't know who this man was yet, but I knew with absolute certainty that he was dangerous. The children had just told me so, using the only safe way they could. I stood up from the table, positioning myself between the approaching man and the kids, and asked if I could help him with something. He said he was Greg Whitfield, the children's stepfather, and he was here to pick them up early. Lily's hand touched her shoulder a 3rd time. I told Greg the pickup time was 5 p.m., as arranged with their mother, that it was only 3:15, and that I couldn't release the children without proper authorization. His smile disappeared. I'd been volunteering as a mentor and tutor at the Northside Community Center in Milwaukee for 3 years, working primarily with kids from low-income families who needed academic support and positive adult role models. The program served about 40 children ranging from ages 6 to 14. I was a high school teacher by profession, taught history and social studies, and volunteering at the community center was my way of giving back outside regular school hours. The work was rewarding in ways my day job sometimes wasn't. These kids needed consistent adults in their lives, people who showed up and paid attention and cared. Many came from chaotic home situations, dealt with poverty and instability, and the community center was often their one safe space. I'd developed relationships with maybe 15 kids over the 3 years, helped them with homework, talked them through problems, just listened when they needed someone to hear them. Lily and Noah Chen. Wait, Chen is on the forbidden list. Let me use different names. Lily and Noah Dawson had been coming to the center for about 8 months. Their mother, Rachel, worked 2 jobs and relied on the after-school program to keep them safe and supervised until she could pick them up at 5 p.m. The kids were bright, but struggled academically, likely because of inconsistent home support. Lily was quiet, watchful, always protecting her younger brother. Noah was more outgoing but had anxiety issues that manifested as stomach aches and difficulty concentrating. Both were good kids who deserved better than whatever circumstances had made them so cautious around adults. The warning gesture had been my idea, implemented after a professional development workshop on recognizing signs of abuse in students. The presenter had talked about how children in dangerous situations often can't verbally report abuse. They're threatened, scared, conditioned to stay silent. She'd suggested creating safe, non-verbal ways for kids to signal distress. I'd brought the idea to the community center director, and we'd implemented a simple system. Each child in the program learned a specific gesture, hand to opposite shoulder, 2 quick touches. If they ever gave that signal, it meant they felt unsafe. Staff were trained to respond immediately by separating the child from the perceived threat and assessing the situation. We'd practiced it with all the kids, made it seem like a game, a secret code. Most of them had never used it. Until today, when Lily and Noah had both signaled within seconds of seeing their stepfather. Greg Whitfield stood in front of me now, his jaw tight, saying he didn't need my authorization to take his own stepchildren. I corrected him. They weren't his children. He wasn't listed as an authorized pickup person on the center's forms, and Rachel had been very specific that only she could pick them up before 5 p.m. Greg said this was ridiculous, that he was family, that I was overstepping. I said I was following center policy, and that he was welcome to call Rachel to authorize the early pickup if needed. Behind me, I could hear Lily's breathing, fast and shallow. She was terrified. Greg's eyes flickered to the children, and something in his expression made my skin crawl. He was calculating something, weighing options. The community center director, a woman named Judith Alvarez who'd been running the program for 12 years, appeared in the doorway. She'd been alerted by another staff member who'd noticed the tension. Judith asked if there was a problem. I explained that Greg wanted to pick up the Dawson children early, but wasn't authorized. Judith checked her tablet with the registration forms and confirmed that only Rachel Dawson was listed for pickup. Greg argued that he was the stepfather, that he lived with the children, that this was bureaucratic nonsense. Judith remained calm but firm, said our policy required written authorization from the parent, that Greg could have Rachel call or email to add him to the approved list, but without that documentation, we couldn't release the children. Greg's face flushed with anger. He said this was discrimination, that we were treating him like a criminal for trying to pick up his own family. Judith said it wasn't personal, that we had the same policy for everyone. Greg looked at Lily and Noah and said they were leaving with him to get their things. Neither child moved. Lily's hand was still touching her shoulder. I asked Greg to leave the building or we'd call the police. He stared at me for a long moment, then turned and walked out. The tension in the room dissolved the moment he was gone. Lily started crying quietly. Noah crawled under the table and wouldn't come out. Something was very wrong in that household, and those children had just silently screamed for help. If you are enjoying this story already, please subscribe to see more stories like this. After Greg left, Judith and I moved the children to her office, a quieter space where they might feel safe enough to talk. I knelt down to Noah's level and asked him what was wrong, why he'd given the warning signal. He looked at his sister before answering. Lily said they weren't supposed to tell. I asked who said they weren't supposed to tell. She said Greg, that he'd told them if they ever talked about what happened at home, bad things would happen to their mom. This was textbook abuse dynamics, threats, isolation, enforced silence. I explained that sometimes rules adults give you are bad rules, that if someone is hurting you or making you scared, telling a trusted adult is always the right thing to do. Noah said Greg gets really mad sometimes, that he broke Noah's arm once but told the doctor it was from falling off a bike. Lily said Greg yells at their mom and sometimes hits her, that they're scared of him, that they didn't want to go home. Judith immediately called Rachel at work, explained what had happened with Greg trying to pick up the kids, explained that the children were upset and had made concerning statements about violence at home, asked if Rachel could come to the center to discuss the situation. Rachel said she'd be there within 30 minutes. Judith then called Child Protective Services, said she was mandated to report suspected child abuse, that we had 2 children making statements about physical violence from a step-parent. CPS said they'd send an investigator that afternoon. The CPS investigator arrived before Rachel did. Her name was Monica Stevens. She'd been with Milwaukee County CPS for 9 years and specialized in domestic violence cases involving children. She interviewed Lily and Noah separately, gentle but thorough questions about home life, about Greg, about injuries, about fear. The children's stories were consistent. Greg had moved in with them and their mother about 10 months ago. At first he'd been nice. Then he'd started getting angry, yelling, breaking things. He'd hit Rachel multiple times when the kids were present. He'd grabbed Noah hard enough to bruise his arms. He'd pushed Lily into a wall. He'd broken Noah's arm during an argument 3 months ago and had threatened the family that if they told anyone he'd done it, he'd make sure Rachel lost her job and they'd lose their apartment. The children lived in constant fear. Monica took photographs of old bruises on Noah's arms, documented everything the children said, asked about other adults in their lives who might have noticed signs of abuse. Lily mentioned me, said I was the only grown-up besides their mom who was nice to them. Monica asked if I'd noticed anything concerning about the children before today. I said I'd noticed they were anxious and hypervigilant, that Noah had frequent stomach aches that seemed stress-related, that Lily was protective of her brother in ways that suggested she felt responsible for his safety, all consistent with children living in an abusive environment. Monica said she'd need to interview Rachel as well and would likely be placing the children in emergency protective custody while the investigation proceeded. My heart sank. Protective custody meant foster care, meant separating the kids from their mother, but it also meant they wouldn't be going home to Greg. Rachel arrived at 4:45 p.m., still in her work uniform from the nursing home, where she was a certified nursing assistant. She looked exhausted and worried, asked what had happened. Judith explained about Greg's attempt to pick up the children, about the children giving the danger signal and making disclosures about violence at home. Rachel's face crumpled. She started crying, said she'd tried to protect them, that she'd been planning to leave Greg but was scared and didn't have money for a new place. Monica gently explained that she was legally required to ensure the children's safety, that based on their statements and visible injuries, she was placing them in emergency foster care for 72 hours while CPS investigated. Rachel could challenge the removal at a hearing within 3 business days. Rachel begged her not to take the children, said she'd make Greg leave, said she'd file for a restraining order, anything to keep her kids. Monica said she understood, but that the immediate concern was the children's physical safety, that Rachel needed to demonstrate she could protect them from Greg before they could return home. Rachel signed the paperwork with shaking hands, watched through tears as Monica led Lily and Noah out of the building to a waiting CPS vehicle. The children looked back at their mother like she was betraying them. It was devastating to witness, but necessary. Those children couldn't spend another night in a home with someone who'd already broken one of them and terrorized both. I stayed late at the center filling out incident reports, documenting everything I'd observed and heard. Judith said this wasn't the first time they'd had to call CPS on a family, but it never got easier. She asked if I'd be willing to testify if the case went to court. I said absolutely, that those kids deserved every protection we could give them. I drove home to my apartment in Bayview, thinking about the warning gesture, about how Lily's hand had moved to her shoulder the instant she'd seen Greg. The signal had worked exactly as intended. She'd been able to alert me to danger without saying a word, without putting herself at greater risk, and I'd been able to respond and protect her. But it also meant the danger had been real and ongoing. The children had been living with an abuser for 10 months, developing survival strategies and trauma responses, while the adults around them had failed to notice or intervene. I'd been working with Lily and Noah for 8 months and had missed it. The guilt of that weighed heavy. I should have seen the signs earlier. Should have asked more questions about the bruises and the stomach aches and the hypervigilance. I'd been trained to recognize abuse. How had I missed it for so long? The answer was that abusers are skilled at hiding their behavior, that children are taught to lie and minimize to protect their abusers, that the system is designed to preserve family units even when those units are harmful. But it still felt like failure. The next morning, I received a call from Detective Laura Bennett, Milwaukee PD's Sensitive Crimes Division, who'd been assigned to investigate Greg Whitfield for child abuse and domestic violence. She'd been a detective for 14 years and handled hundreds of cases involving violence against children and intimate partners. She wanted to interview me about my observations of the Dawson children and the incident with Greg. We met at the police station downtown at 10 a.m. I walked through everything: the warning gesture, Greg's arrival and demeanor, the children's visible fear, their disclosures about violence at home, the bruises on Noah. Detective Bennett took detailed notes and asked if I'd noticed any other signs of abuse during the 8 months I'd been working with the children. I mentioned that Lily sometimes flinched when I moved suddenly, that Noah had what seemed like anxiety-related stomach issues, that both children were extremely compliant and conflict-avoidant in ways that suggested they'd been conditioned to avoid making adults angry. Bennett said those were all common trauma responses in abused children. She asked about Rachel, the mother, whether I thought she was complicit in the abuse or a victim herself. I said Rachel had always seemed caring but overwhelmed, that she worked constantly and relied heavily on the community center for childcare. That based on the children's statements, she was also being abused by Greg and was likely trapped by fear and financial dependence. Bennett said she'd be interviewing Rachel next and would be recommending the district attorney file charges against Greg for child abuse, domestic violence, and witness intimidation. She said the children's testimony would be crucial, but that physical evidence like the healed fracture in Noah's arm would also be important. She'd already subpoenaed his medical records from the emergency room visit 3 months ago. The emergency room records told a damning story. Noah had presented with a displaced fracture of his left radius requiring reduction and casting. The attending physician, Dr. Kevin Simmons, who'd been practicing emergency medicine for 8 years, had documented in his notes that the injury pattern was inconsistent with the stated cause, a fall from a bicycle. Fractures from bike falls typically showed impact damage to the hand or wrist as the child tried to catch themselves. Noah's fracture showed evidence of twisting force, more consistent with being grabbed and wrenched. Dr. Simmons had noted in the chart that he'd suspected non-accidental trauma, but Rachel had been present and vouched for the bike fall story. He'd documented his suspicion, but hadn't reported it to CPS, which he was legally required to do. Detective Bennett said the hospital's failure to report would likely be investigated separately. But the medical records proved that Noah had sustained a significant injury 3 months ago under suspicious circumstances, that Greg had been present when the ER visit occurred, and that the family had lied about how it happened. Combined with the children's current disclosures and the fresh bruises Monica had photographed, the case against Greg was solid. Bennett said she'd be executing a search warrant on the family's apartment to look for additional evidence and would likely arrest Greg within 48 hours. She asked if I'd be willing to testify at trial about the warning gesture and the children's fear response when Greg appeared. I said yes, without hesitation. Rachel called me that evening, got my number from Judith at the community center. She was crying, said she'd just come from a meeting with a domestic violence advocate and a family law attorney, said CPS was requiring her to get a restraining order against Greg, attend domestic violence counseling, and complete a safety plan before the children could return to her care. Asked if I thought she was a bad mother for letting this happen. I said no, that abusive relationships are complicated and trap people through fear and manipulation, that the important thing was she was taking steps now to protect herself and her children. She said Greg had been texting her nonstop since yesterday, alternating between apologizing and threatening, saying if she testified against him or kept him from the kids, he'd ruin her life. The attorney had told her to save all the messages as evidence. I asked if she had somewhere safe to stay. She said she'd gone to a domestic violence shelter that had space for her while Greg was still at the apartment. Said the shelter advocate was helping her file for the restraining order tomorrow morning. I told her the children were asking about her, that they were scared but physically safe, that she was doing the right thing by protecting them, even though it was hard. She said thank you for noticing that something was wrong, for believing the kids, for not letting Greg take them. I said I wished I'd noticed sooner. She said you noticed when it mattered, and that's what saved them. The restraining order hearing was held on Friday morning, 2 days after the children had been removed. I attended as a witness, prepared to testify about Greg's behavior at the community center and the children's visible fear of him. Rachel was represented by a legal aid attorney named David Kowalski, who'd been practicing domestic violence law for 11 years. Greg showed up with his own attorney, a private defense lawyer named Richard Cross, who'd been practicing criminal defense for 16 years and had a reputation for being aggressive. The judge was Judge Pamela Wright, who'd been on the family court bench for 13 years. Rachel's attorney presented evidence of abuse, photographs of bruises on Rachel from previous incidents she'd finally documented, the threatening text messages Greg had sent over the past 2 days, the children's statements to CPS, the medical records from Noah's arm fracture. I testified about Greg's threatening demeanor at the community center and the children's terror signals. Dr. Simmons testified about his suspicions when he'd treated Noah's fracture 3 months ago. The evidence was overwhelming. Greg's attorney tried to argue that Rachel was fabricating allegations to gain advantage in a custody dispute, that the children had been coached by CPS, that I was a biased witness who'd overreacted to a stepfather trying to pick up his kids. None of it was convincing. Judge Wright granted the temporary restraining order, prohibiting Greg from contact with Rachel or the children and requiring him to move out of the apartment within 24 hours under police supervision. She scheduled a permanent restraining order hearing for 2 weeks later. Greg glared at Rachel as he left the courtroom. The threat in that look was unmistakable. Greg was arrested the following Monday on charges of child abuse, domestic violence, and intimidation of a witness. The district attorney, a prosecutor named William Nash, who'd been handling violent crimes for 18 years, had reviewed all the evidence and determined there was probable cause for multiple felonies. Greg's bail was set at $50,000. He made bail within days, probably using money from his job as a sales manager at a car dealership. One of the bail conditions was that he had to abide by the restraining order and have no contact with Rachel or the children. Detective Bennett said that people who violate restraining orders do so within the first few weeks, that Greg's pattern of control and intimidation suggested he'd try to maintain power over Rachel. She advised Rachel to vary her routines, park in well-lit areas, document any contact attempts. The domestic violence shelter where Rachel was staying had good security protocols, but she couldn't stay there forever. She needed to get her children back and rebuild some kind of normal life. The 72-hour emergency custody period had been extended to a 10-day temporary removal, while CPS completed their investigation. Rachel was attending mandated domestic violence counseling, working with the shelter advocate to create a safety plan, preparing the apartment for the children's return now that Greg was out. But CPS wasn't satisfied yet. They wanted proof that Rachel could protect the children from Greg before returning them to her care. The permanent restraining order hearing 2 weeks later provided some of that proof. Greg's attorney filed a motion to dismiss the temporary order, arguing there was insufficient evidence of actual violence, that the children's statements were unreliable, that Rachel was manipulating the system. The motion was denied. Judge Wright heard testimony from Rachel about years of escalating abuse she'd endured, emotional manipulation, financial control, physical violence that had intensified over the 10 months Greg lived with them. Heard testimony from Lily, who at age 10 was allowed to speak about her experiences. Lily told the judge in a small but steady voice that Greg scared her, that he hurt her and her brother, that she didn't feel safe when he was around. The judge asked Lily about the warning gesture she'd given at the community center. Lily explained that Mr. Rivers, meaning me, had taught all the kids a secret signal for when they felt unsafe, that she'd used it when Greg showed up because she knew he was dangerous. The judge asked how she knew. Lily said because he'd broken Noah's arm and threatened to hurt their mom if they told anyone. Judge Wright's expression hardened. She issued a permanent 5-year restraining order against Greg, prohibiting any contact with Rachel, Lily, or Noah. Said the evidence clearly demonstrated a pattern of abuse and that the children's safety required distance from Greg. Greg's attorney objected, said his client's constitutional rights were being violated. Judge Wright said Greg's rights ended where the children's safety began. The restraining order would stand. CPS scheduled a family team meeting to discuss reunification. Monica Stevens, the investigator, said Rachel had completed all required steps: domestic violence counseling, safety planning, securing the apartment with new locks, and a security system. Greg was out of the home and legally prohibited from contact. The children had been in foster care for 18 days, were doing okay but understandably wanted to go home. The foster parents reported that both kids had nightmares and separation anxiety. Lily was protective of Noah to an extent that suggested parentification, a trauma response where a child takes on adult responsibilities for a sibling's safety. Noah still had frequent stomach aches and was seeing a pediatrician to rule out physical causes. Both children were starting trauma therapy with Dr. Rebecca Foster, a child psychologist who'd been treating abuse victims for 14 years. Dr. Foster said the children needed stability and attachment to their primary caregiver, meaning Rachel, but also needed assurance that they were safe from Greg. She recommended reunification with intensive in-home support services to monitor the family and provide resources. CPS agreed. Rachel was crying when Monica told her the children could come home, that she'd proven she could protect them, that the agency would continue monitoring but believed she was ready. The children returned home on a Friday afternoon. I went to the apartment to welcome them back, brought books and art supplies as gifts. They seemed relieved to be home but also watchful, hyper-aware, waiting for something bad to happen. That vigilance would take a long time to fade. Greg violated the restraining order 3 weeks after the children returned home. Rachel was walking from her car to her apartment building at 9 p.m., after her evening shift, when Greg appeared from the parking lot shadows. Said they needed to talk, that she couldn't just throw away their relationship, that he loved her and the kids. Rachel tried to walk away, but Greg grabbed her arm, started saying he'd changed, that he'd taken anger management classes, that she was ruining his life by keeping him from his family. Rachel pulled out her phone and told Greg she was calling the police, that he was violating the restraining order. Greg's expression shifted from pleading to rage in an instant. He grabbed the phone from her hand and threw it on the ground, shattering it. Started yelling about how Rachel had turned everyone against him, how the courts were biased against men, how she'd pay for destroying his reputation. A neighbor heard the commotion and called 911. Police arrived within minutes, found Greg still berating Rachel in the parking lot, arrested him for violating the restraining order, destruction of property, and harassment. His bail was revoked. He sat in jail awaiting trial on the original charges, plus the new violation. Detective Bennett said the violation actually helped their case, showed Greg's pattern of control and inability to respect boundaries even under court order, made it more likely a jury would convict on the abuse charges. The trial for the child abuse and domestic violence charges was scheduled for 4 months after Greg's arrest. The intervening months were a strange limbo period where life tried to return to normal but couldn't quite get there. Lily and Noah returned to the community center after-school program. They still used the warning gesture occasionally when they felt anxious, even though Greg wasn't there. I continued tutoring them and saw slow progress in their emotional recovery. Lily smiled more. Noah's stomach aches decreased in frequency. Both children were bonding with Dr. Foster in therapy, learning to process their trauma and develop healthier coping mechanisms. Rachel threw herself into creating a stable home environment, decorated the apartment in bright colors, established consistent routines, spent quality time with the kids on her days off. She was still in domestic violence support groups, still vigilant about safety, still healing from years of abuse. But she was also finding strength she hadn't known she had. Said going through the court process, testifying against Greg, protecting her children, it had given her a sense of agency she'd lost during the relationship. She was reclaiming herself. The community center director Judith said she'd never seen a family transform so completely through crisis. That sometimes the worst moments revealed what people were truly capable of, and Rachel had proven capable of immense courage. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. The trial lasted 6 days. The prosecution called numerous witnesses, Rachel testifying about the pattern of abuse, the children testifying about specific incidents of violence, Dr. Simmons testifying about Noah's suspicious fracture, Monica Stevens testifying about her investigation and the children's initial disclosures, Detective Bennett testifying about the evidence gathered and Greg's restraining order violation. I testified about the warning gesture and the children's visible terror when Greg appeared at the community center. The defense's strategy was to paint Rachel as a vindictive ex-partner who'd coached the children to lie, to suggest the injuries were accidental, to claim Greg's behavior in the parking lot had been a frustrated man trying to communicate with someone he loved. Richard Cross, Greg's attorney, cross-examined each witness aggressively. Tried to get Rachel to admit she'd been angry at Greg and wanted revenge. Tried to get the children to contradict themselves about details of specific abuse incidents. Tried to suggest I'd planted the idea of danger in the children's minds by teaching them the warning gesture. None of it worked. The evidence was too consistent, too well documented, too obviously true. The jury saw through the defense's tactics. The prosecutor, William Nash, presented medical evidence, photographs of injuries, text message threats, and testimony from multiple credible witnesses. In his closing argument, he said this was a clear case of a violent man who'd terrorized a family for months and then tried to intimidate them into silence when they finally spoke up. That the children had been brave enough to signal for help and the adults in their lives had been vigilant enough to respond. That Greg Whitfield deserved to be held accountable for the harm he'd caused. The jury deliberated for 9 hours over 2 days, came back with guilty verdicts on all counts, 3 counts of child abuse for the injuries to both children and the pattern of psychological harm, 4 counts of domestic violence against Rachel for separate incidents of physical assault, and 1 count of witness intimidation for the restraining order violation. Greg showed no emotion when the verdicts were read. Rachel squeezed my hand in the gallery. Sentencing was set for 3 weeks later. Judge Wright, who'd presided over both the restraining order hearings and the criminal trial, heard victim impact statements first. Rachel spoke about years of living in fear, about watching Greg hurt her children and feeling powerless to stop it, about the courage it took to finally leave and protect her family, about still having nightmares and panic attacks, but also having hope now that Greg was being held accountable. Lily spoke briefly, said she was glad Greg couldn't hurt them anymore, that she wanted other kids to know they could tell trusted adults when something was wrong. Noah was too young to give a statement, but Dr. Foster spoke on his behalf, describing the trauma he'd experienced and the ongoing therapy he'd need to recover. I gave a statement about the importance of teaching children they had the right to signal for help and the responsibility adults had to respond to those signals, that the warning gesture had worked because everyone in the system had taken it seriously. Judge Wright sentenced Greg to 12 years in prison, 4 years for each child abuse count to run consecutively, with the domestic violence and intimidation charges to run concurrently. Said the sentence reflected the severity of terrorizing children in their own home and the need to protect this family from further harm. The years after Greg's conviction were about healing and rebuilding. Rachel thrived in ways I'd never seen during the period when Greg was in her life. She got promoted at the nursing home, started taking college courses toward becoming a registered nurse, bought a modest house in a safer neighborhood. The children continued therapy and showed remarkable resilience. Lily grew into a confident middle schooler who advocated for other kids experiencing abuse, spoke at a community awareness event about the importance of the warning gesture. Noah's anxiety decreased significantly. His stomach aches became rare rather than constant. He joined a soccer league and made friends. Both children maintained relationships with their foster parents from those 18 days, visiting occasionally and staying connected to people who'd cared for them during crisis. The foster mother said she'd never seen children bounce back from trauma so successfully, attributed it to Rachel's fierce protective love and the strong support system around them. Dr. Foster said having adults who believed them and took immediate action when they signaled danger had been crucial to their recovery. That knowing they'd been heard and protected had given them trust in the system and in relationships. They weren't permanently broken by what they'd endured. They were wounded but healing, traumatized but resilient, forever changed but not destroyed. I continued volunteering at the community center and eventually trained other mentors on recognizing signs of abuse and implementing the warning gesture system. The signal was adopted by after-school programs across Milwaukee as a best practice for child safety. Became something kids were taught as routinely as stranger danger and fire safety, a simple, nonverbal way to communicate distress when words weren't safe. In the 5 years since implementing it, the gesture had been used by 17 different children to signal various threats, ranging from bullying to abuse to unsafe situations. Each time, staff had responded immediately, and each time the intervention had led to the child being protected. The system worked because everyone took it seriously, because children were taught their signals mattered, because adults were trained to watch for and respond to nonverbal cues. Lily and Noah had been the first children to use the gesture in a truly dangerous situation, and their courage in giving that signal had quite literally saved them from ongoing abuse. The simple act of touching a shoulder twice had set in motion a chain of protection. My immediate intervention, Judith's support, the CPS investigation, the police involvement, the court proceedings, the conviction. All because 2 children had known they could signal for help, and a mentor had been watching for the sign. Greg is still in prison, 5 years into his 12-year sentence. He'll be eligible for parole in another 7 years. Rachel has said if he's released, she'll reinstate the restraining order and remain vigilant. But she's also said she refuses to live in fear anymore, that Greg took enough years from her, and she won't give him any more. The children, now 15 and 12, barely remember the details of living with Greg. Their trauma therapist says that's normal for childhood trauma. The specific memories fade, but the emotional impacts linger. Both kids are in therapy less frequently now, have developed healthy coping strategies, are functioning well in school and socially. They still know the warning gesture, still use it occasionally when they feel anxious or unsafe in situations that trigger old trauma. But now it's just one tool among many they've learned for communicating their needs and protecting themselves. I see them at the community center sometimes. Lily volunteers there now, helps younger kids with homework the way I once helped her. Noah comes to the sports programs. They've become part of the center's success story, proof that early intervention and consistent support can help children survive and thrive despite terrible circumstances. Rachel says she'll always be grateful that her children had been taught a way to signal danger and that I'd been paying enough attention to see it. I tell her the children saved themselves by being brave enough to use the signal. But we both know it took both, their courage and the adults' vigilance, to break the cycle of abuse. Looking back at that Wednesday afternoon when Lily's hand first touched her shoulder, I'm struck by how much hung on that small gesture. If I hadn't been watching, if I hadn't taken it seriously, if I'd dismissed it or rationalized it or decided it wasn't my place to intervene, if any link in the protection chain had broken, the children would have gone home with Greg that day. The abuse would have continued. The escalation that's typical in domestic violence situations would likely have resulted in more serious injuries or worse. But because everyone did their job, because I responded to the signal, because Judith supported the intervention, because CPS investigated thoroughly, because Detective Bennett built a solid case, because the prosecutor and judge took it seriously, 2 children were removed from a dangerous situation and a violent man was held accountable. The system worked the way it's supposed to work. Not perfectly, not without causing trauma of its own through foster care and court proceedings, but well enough that 2 kids are alive and healing instead of continuing to suffer in silence. That's the power of teaching children they have the right to signal for help and training adults to recognize and respond to those signals. The warning gesture that Lily and Noah gave when their stepfather showed up wasn't just a signal of danger. It was an act of trust. They trusted that I would see it, understand it, and protect them. And I did. That's what saved them. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.